My own mother stood up in court, pointed at me, and screamed that I was mentally incompetent. I didn't say a word. Then the judge leaned forward and asked my mother's lawyer one question, and everything changed. My mother didn't hesitate. She stood up in the middle of the courtroom, pointed straight at me, and said loud and clear, "She is mentally incompetent. She always has been." The word incompetent landed like a verdict before the judge had even spoken. I was sitting at the respondent's table in the St. Clair County Probate Court, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my back straight, my eyes fixed on a dark scratch in the wooden surface. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at anyone. I had learned long ago that the fastest way to lose control was to react. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably in the back row. A pen clattered to the floor. My mother kept going. "She's unstable. She's emotional. She should never be allowed to manage money, let alone inherit an estate." I stayed silent, not because I was weak, not because she was right, but because silence was the only thing she hadn't prepared for. Judge Eleanor Whitcomb sat behind the bench, her expression unreadable. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back tightly and glasses perched low on her nose. She let my mother speak without interruption. That alone told me this wasn't going to be a short hearing. "My name is Evelyn Cross. I was 34 years old, and according to the woman who gave birth to me, I was no longer fit to control my own life." The hearing was supposed to be about my grandmother's estate. That was the official reason we were all there. But everyone in that room knew this wasn't really about money. It was about control, about humiliation, about rewriting history in public. My grandmother, Ruth Cross, had died 8 months earlier in her small house in Riversend. She passed peacefully in her sleep. I was holding her hand when it happened. She raised me when my parents' marriage fell apart. She packed my lunches, helped with homework, taught me how to balance a checkbook before I was old enough to drive. She left me everything she had. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother contested the will. 6 weeks later, she filed an emergency petition claiming I was mentally incompetent and demanded that a conservator be appointed immediately, herself. That single filing was enough to freeze the estate, enough to stall probate, enough to quietly damage my career. My firm placed me on administrative leave pending review. Clients stopped returning calls. Colleagues avoided conversations they didn't want to have. No one accused me outright, but no one defended me either. Doubt doesn't need proof. It just needs space. Now my mother stood in court, calm and composed, describing me as a lifelong problem. She talked about concern, about fear, about responsibility. She spoke like a woman trying to save her daughter from herself. Anyone who didn't know our history might have believed her. She finished her statement and sat down, smoothing her blazer as if she'd just delivered something rehearsed and well-received. Her attorney, Arthur Nolan, gave a small nod, satisfied. Judge Whitcomb finally spoke. "Miss Cross," she said, turning her attention to me, "do you wish to respond to the allegations?" The room held its breath. I shook my head once. "No, Your Honor." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting would have been. Judge Whitcomb studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to Mr. Nolan. "Counselor," she said evenly, "before we proceed, may I ask you a question?" Arthur Nolan straightened. "Of course, Your Honor." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" He blinked. "She's an accountant. She works locally." The judge didn't respond right away. Her gaze returned to me, then back to my mother, then once more to her attorney. Something in her expression shifted. Not anger, not sympathy, recognition. And that was when I understood something my mother didn't. She thought this hearing was about taking something from me. She had no idea it was about revealing who she really was. Because while she had been telling stories, I had been keeping records. And this courtroom, this moment, was only the beginning. My mother didn't choose her accusations randomly. She knew exactly where to aim. When she called me mentally unstable in court, she wasn't inventing a story. She was reaching back to something real, something old, fragile, and deeply personal, something she knew I would never want dragged into the light. Because once, a long time ago, I had been broken. I was 14 years old when my parents divorced. It wasn't quiet or civilized or mutual. It was explosive. shouting matches that bled through walls, doors slammed hard enough to rattle windows. Then one morning, my father packed a suitcase and left the state. 2 months later, my mother remarried. 3 months after that, she stopped calling me her daughter. She didn't fight for custody. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't come to school events or birthdays or holidays. I became an inconvenience she had already moved past. I went to live with my grandmother, Ruth, in Riversend. From the outside, it looked like a rescue, and in many ways, it was. But inside me, something had already cracked. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. I cried in places where no one could see me. A school counselor noticed and suggested a few sessions to help me adjust. I talked. I cried. I learned words like abandonment and low self-worth before I was old enough to vote. And then, slowly, I got better. What my mother did next was something I didn't understand until years later. As my legal guardian at the time, her name stayed on my records, intake forms, counseling notes, administrative paperwork. She never asked for copies back then. She didn't need to. She kept them, like ammunition. When she filed her petition decades later, those old documents resurfaced, stripped of context, stripped of time, stripped of healing. A scared teenager became a lifelong pattern. Temporary pain became chronic instability. She knew no one would read closely. She knew no one would ask what happened after, because allegations are louder than explanations. By the time the court papers reached me, my life was already unraveling in quiet, humiliating ways. My firm called me into a conference room one afternoon. No accusations, no raised voices, just careful language, liability, reputation, optics. They believed me, they said. But belief wasn't the issue. Risk was. I wasn't fired. I was sidelined. No new cases, no expert testimony, no work that mattered. 7 years of building credibility, erased with one filing. At home, the damage spread too. My boyfriend, Daniel Brooks, tried to be supportive. He really did. He came from a family where problems were solved by talking things through over dinner, where parents didn't weaponize the past. At first, he told me it would be okay. That truth always comes out. Then his parents started asking questions. Then friends asked careful, awkward things. Then one night, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, Daniel said something that changed everything. "Why don't you just take a psychological evaluation?" he asked gently. "Just to prove them wrong." I stared at him. Not because I didn't understand the logic, but because I understood the implication. If I agreed, I validated the accusation. If I refused, I looked guilty. My mother had trapped me perfectly. That night, Daniel left after our first real argument. I sat alone in my apartment staring at a framed photo of my grandmother at my college graduation. She was 73 in that picture, beaming like I'd just conquered the world. She used to say, "People lie, numbers don't." I held on to that thought as everything else slipped. What my mother didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she was building a narrative, I was quietly observing patterns. She knew my emotional weak spots, she knew my history, but she didn't know my training. She didn't know that I had spent years tracking fraud, following paper trails, watching liars collapse under their own inconsistencies. She thought she was dragging me back into the past. What she was really doing was pushing me into my element. Because once you understand how someone is trying to hurt you, you start asking why. And when I finally asked that question, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't about my grandmother's wishes. It wasn't even about me. It was about desperation. And desperation always leaves a trail. The first thing I did was stop trying to explain myself. Explanations were emotional, numbers were not. My grandmother had added my name to her primary bank account 2 years before she died. She said it was for convenience, so I could help pay bills if her arthritis got worse, if driving became difficult. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, that small detail became the only reason I could see what others couldn't. Late one night, long after Daniel had left and the apartment had gone quiet, I logged into the account. I told myself I was just checking balances. I told myself I was looking for reassurance. Instead, I found questions. At first glance, everything looked normal. Utility payments, property taxes, groceries, pharmacy charges. My grandmother had always been predictable, meticulous. She paid the same bills at nearly the same times every month. Then I widened the date range. I pulled statements from the final 2 years of her life and dropped them into a spreadsheet. I sorted deposits and withdrawals. I color-coded categories. It was muscle memory, something I'd done hundreds of times before for other people. That was when the pattern appeared. 7 cash withdrawals, not checks, not transfers, cash. They didn't align with any regular expense. No utilities, no medical bills, no home repairs, just large round numbers, 4,000, 6,000, 12,000, taken out at irregular intervals. I highlighted them and leaned back in my chair. Total, $48,200. My pulse picked up, but I forced myself to slow down. 1 anomaly is a coincidence. 2 is a curiosity. 7 is intent. I pulled up my grandmother's calendar next. She kept everything written down. Doctor appointments, church meetings, even casual visits. I cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals with her notes. Every single one occurred within 3 days of a visit from my mother. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. This was the moment where most people would panic, or cry, or call someone in the middle of the night just to hear a voice. I made coffee, because panic clouds judgment, and judgment was the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. I didn't know how the money had been taken yet, only that it had, and that meant there was more. Because people who steal once rarely stop. The next morning, I drove to Riversend. My grandmother's house still smelled like her, lavender cleaner and old paper. I moved through it slowly, opening drawers, cabinets, folders, not rifling, not rushing, just observing. At first, I thought her record-keeping had deteriorated near the end. Receipts missing, envelopes unlabeled, papers out of order. Then a colder thought settled in. What if the disorder wasn't accidental? I checked the obvious places first. Filing cabinet, desk drawers, the small lockbox in her closet. Nothing definitive. And then I remembered the safe deposit box. Harbor State Bank, downtown Riversend. She'd added my name to it years earlier, after a minor break-in scare in the neighborhood. I'd helped her store some jewelry and important documents. After that, life happened. I forgot about it completely. The bank manager recognized her name immediately. He was kind, professional. He didn't ask questions. The box was heavier than I expected. Inside were the things I remembered: jewelry, documents, savings bonds. And one thing I didn't: a brown leather journal. The first entry was dated 14 months before her death. I sat on the small bench inside the vault room and opened it. The handwriting was steady at first, familiar, comforting. She wrote about my mother calling unexpectedly, about apologies, about wanting to reconnect. She wrote that she didn't fully trust it, but she was tired and hope can be persuasive. As the entries continued, the tone changed. Amounts appeared, dates, short notes written with increasing precision. Gave her money today. She said it was urgent. She asked me to sign papers. I was confused. My hands started to shake. This wasn't rambling. This wasn't confusion. This was documentation. My grandmother knew something was wrong, and instead of confronting it, maybe out of shame, maybe out of fear, she did the one thing she had always done when something didn't make sense. She wrote it down. By the time I reached the final pages, I was no longer searching for answers. I was collecting proof. I closed the journal carefully and sat there longer than I meant to, breathing in the cool, stale air of the vault. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the muffled sounds of the bank continuing on like nothing had changed. I realized then that this story, the real one, was bigger than me. And if you've stayed with me this far, paying attention to the quiet details instead of waiting for explosions, you probably understand why that matters. Because the truth rarely announces itself. It waits to be noticed. I left the bank with the journal under my arm and a single, terrifying certainty settling in my chest. My mother hadn't just lied about me. She had been stealing from her own mother. And now, whether she knew it or not, she had invited the worst possible person to look closely. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because fear had finally been replaced by something sharper. Focus. The kind that tightens behind your eyes and refuses to let go. The journal told me what had happened. It didn't yet tell me how. By morning, I was back at my grandmother's dining table. Papers spread out in careful rows, bank statements, calendar notes, photographs I'd taken of the journal pages. I worked the way I always did, methodically, without assumptions. That was when I noticed the gap. There were withdrawals I could now explain, but there was a period where the account activity suddenly became smooth, too smooth. Payments bundled, transfers clean, almost professional. Someone had taken control. I drove back to Harbor State Bank before lunch and requested copies of every authorization document tied to my grandmother's accounts. It took longer than usual. Extra approvals, a quiet conversation behind a glass office. When the folder finally landed in front of me, I felt a cold certainty settle in. There it was, a power of attorney, dated 9 months before my grandmother's death, granting full financial authority to Marjorie Hale. At first glance, it looked legitimate. Correct formatting, proper language, a familiar-looking signature. But I didn't look at signatures first. I looked at notarization. The stamp belonged to a notary named Calvin Moore. I knew that name. Not personally, but professionally. I'd seen it before in a different context, years ago, in a case involving improperly filed documents. Calvin Moore had retired, quietly. His notary commission had expired more than 3 years earlier. I checked the date on the document again. The power of attorney had been notarized after his retirement. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a technicality. This was a felony. The signature might have been real, signed on a bad day, under pressure by a woman who trusted the wrong person. But the notarization? That was fabricated. Someone had taken an old stamp and used it to give illegal authority real teeth. I scanned the document and forwarded it to my attorney, Helen Ward, with a single line. This shouldn't exist. She called me within 5 minutes. Where did you get this? She asked. At the bank, I said. It's already on file. It's been used. There was a pause. Then, Evelyn, this changes everything. She was right. Up until that moment, my mother's case was cruel, but civil. Lies, manipulation, character assassination. This document turned it criminal. Helen told me not to confront anyone. Not my mother, not her attorney, not the bank. She said we needed to let them believe their story was still intact. People who think they're winning, she said, make mistakes. So I waited. And while I waited, I dug deeper. I pulled records tied to the power of attorney, transactions authorized under it, changes in account access, patterns in timing. The name Leonard Hale, my stepfather, kept appearing. Not as a signer, not as an owner. As a destination. Funds moved, accounts linked, short-term transfers that vanished quickly. It wasn't just my mother. It never is. That evening, Daniel came over quietly, unsure if he was welcome. I showed him the document. I showed him the dates, the stamp, the mismatch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat there, reading. When he looked up, his voice was different. They thought you wouldn't notice, he said. Yes, I replied. And they thought no one would believe me if I did. The next day, Helen filed our response to the court. It was intentionally boring. We denied the allegations. We affirmed my competency. We requested a hearing. No exhibits, no counterclaims, no fireworks. I wanted them relaxed. 2 weeks later, my deposition was scheduled. Arthur Nolan asked predictable questions: education, employment, mental health history. I answered carefully, minimally, truthfully, but without context. I watched my mother on the video screen in the corner. Her posture softened. Her lips curved slightly upward. She thought I was folding. She had no idea I was documenting. Because while they were focused on proving I was unstable, they weren't watching their own steps. And every forged stamp, every rushed withdrawal, every careless assumption was lining up into something far more dangerous than a lost inheritance. It was becoming a pattern, and patterns don't just tell stories, they convict. Up until that point, I had been treating my mother as the center of everything. Her voice, her accusations, her sudden interest in money she hadn't cared about for decades. But once I laid all the documents out in front of me, bank records, authorizations, transfer logs, I started to see what I'd missed before. My mother was loud. The real work had been quiet. The name Leonard Hale appeared again and again, never where it should have been obvious, not on court filings, not on the power of attorney, not as a beneficiary, always adjacent. A linked account here, A short-term transfer there. Funds passing through and disappearing before anyone looking casually would notice. Leonard was my stepfather, the man my mother married 3 months after my parents' divorce. The man who never raised me, never called me, never pretended to care. But he was always there, just outside the frame. I started with public records. Leonard owned 3 small commercial properties in St. Clair City, or at least he used to. Over the past 4 years, 2 had been refinanced. 1 had been quietly sold. Liens had appeared, then disappeared. Creditors rotated like a carousel. It wasn't collapse. It was struggle. People don't suddenly start stealing from family unless they're running out of time. I pulled business filings next. His companies shifted names slightly over the years. New LLCs, same addresses, same phone numbers, same accountant. Old tricks. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. Leonard didn't plan. He reacted. And when pressure mounted, he looked for vulnerable people with access to money, like an elderly woman who wanted to believe her daughter had changed. Still, suspicion wasn't enough. I needed confirmation. That confirmation arrived in the form of a message request I wasn't expecting. Phoebe Hale, Leonard's daughter from his first marriage. She had submitted a signed statement supporting my mother's petition, claiming I had always seemed unstable and irresponsible. According to the court file, that statement carried weight. She wanted to meet. My attorney advised against it immediately. It could be a trap, Helen said. Anything you say could be twisted. She was right. But I remembered something from the deposition. When Leonard's name came up, Phoebe had looked away from the camera. Not casually, not politely, instinctively. I agreed to meet her, on neutral ground. A cafe off the highway between Riversend and the city. Public. Ordinary. Safe. Phoebe arrived early. She looked thinner than her photo. Tired. Her hands never stopped moving. Stirring coffee she didn't drink, folding napkins, tapping the edge of the table. She didn't start with apologies. She started with honesty. My dad wrote that statement, she said quietly. He told me to sign it. I waited. He said it was just paperwork, she continued. He said you'd never even see it. I asked her why she agreed. She hesitated, then looked down at her wrist, touched it lightly, as if checking something invisible. He said I owed him. That was all she needed to say. Phoebe told me about Leonard's mother, Elaine Hale. She'd lived in assisted care out of state, had dementia, real dementia. Leonard had power of attorney. By the time Elaine died, her estate was nearly empty. Leonard said the care costs had eaten everything. Years later, Phoebe started asking questions. The numbers didn't make sense. When she confronted him, the conversation ended badly. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Patterns don't repeat by accident. I told Phoebe the truth, that I couldn't protect her, but I could tell the prosecutor she cooperated if she was willing to testify honestly. She agreed, not because she wanted revenge, because she was tired of carrying it. When I drove home that night, the story finally came into focus. My mother wasn't the architect. She was the instrument. Leonard had seen an opportunity, an aging woman, mild cognitive decline, a daughter desperate to reconnect, another daughter isolated and easy to discredit. And he'd played them all. Back at my apartment, Daniel was waiting. I told him everything. When I finished, he didn't ask what would happen next. He asked, "How long have you known how to do this?" "All my life," I said, because my grandmother hadn't just taught me how to balance a checkbook. She taught me how to see what people tried to hide. And Leonard Hale had left fingerprints everywhere. He just hadn't realized someone was finally looking. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Arthur Nolan chose the time deliberately, early enough to feel intimidating, late enough to make sure I had time to worry. He framed it as routine, just a chance to clarify a few things before the hearing. That was fine. Routine was where people lowered their guard. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed plainly. No blazer, no statement jewelry, nothing that suggested confidence or authority. I wanted to look exactly the way my mother expected me to look. Small, tired, unsure. She appeared on the video screen a few minutes later, sitting beside Leonard. She didn't smile when she saw me. She didn't need to. She thought she was already winning. Arthur Nolan began with easy questions. My name, my age, my education. I have a bachelor's degree in accounting, I said. Where did you study? In-state. He nodded, scribbled something down, and moved on. He never asked what I did with that degree. He never asked how long I'd been practicing. He never asked why I'd been called as a witness in other cases. That omission would matter later. When he asked about my mental health history, I didn't flinch. Yes, I said. I saw a counselor briefly as a teenager. Why was that? My parents divorced. How did you respond to that divorce? I struggled, temporarily. I didn't explain further. I didn't contextualize. I didn't defend myself. I answered like someone with nothing left to say. From the corner of the screen, I saw my mother's posture relax. Leonard leaned back in his chair. Phoebe, sitting farther away, kept her eyes on the table. Arthur tried again. Have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness? No. Have you ever been hospitalized? No. Have you ever been declared unfit to manage your own affairs? No. Each answer was clean, boring, unemotional. I could feel the room losing interest in me. That was the goal. People underestimate what doesn't demand attention. 2 hours later, Arthur concluded the deposition with a polite smile. He thanked me for my cooperation. He said we'd see what the judge thought. When the call ended, I exhaled for the first time all morning. Helen looked at me carefully. They think you're folding, she said. I know, I replied. That's why they'll walk straight into it. Over the next 2 weeks, we did nothing that looked aggressive. No motions, no accusations, no sudden revelations. We let the silence do the work. Meanwhile, Helen quietly forwarded the forged notarization to the district attorney. She didn't push. She didn't dramatize. She simply asked them to look. They did. I didn't know how fast they were moving. I didn't need to. I trusted the process the same way my grandmother trusted her ledgers, slowly, patiently, with proof. The night before the hearing, Daniel asked me if I was nervous. I thought about it. I'm not nervous, I said. I'm ready. Because there's a difference. Nerves come from uncertainty. Readiness comes from preparation. That night, I drove out to Riversend one last time. I didn't go inside the house. I just sat in the car, parked across the street, remembering how my grandmother used to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee every Sunday morning, balancing her checkbook by hand. She never rushed. She always double-checked. I understood now that she hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a method. The next morning, the courtroom filled quickly, not with spectators, but with tension. People sense when something is about to break, even if they don't know why. My mother arrived late, confident. Leonard followed, composed. Arthur shuffled papers like a man who believed he knew the ending. I sat quietly beside Helen. If you've ever wondered why some stories unfold slowly, why details matter, why silence can be louder than accusations, it's because moments like this don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves. And if you've been following closely, noticing the small shifts, instead of waiting for fireworks, you already know what comes next. Because the judge hadn't asked her question yet. And once she did, there would be no way back. Courtrooms have their own rhythm. Most people don't notice it. They focus on the arguments, the raised voices, the occasional outburst. But when you've spent enough time in them, you learn that the real turning points are quiet. They arrive in the pause between sentences, in the way a judge stops taking notes, in a question asked just a little too calmly. The hearing began exactly as Arthur Nolan expected it to. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and launched into a polished narrative about a concerned mother trying to protect a vulnerable estate. He spoke about distance, about regret, about a daughter who had struggled emotionally for most of her life. My mother nodded at the right moments. Leonard kept his hands folded, eyes lowered in practiced restraint. Arthur never once looked at me while he spoke. He didn't need to. In his version of the story, I was already an object, not a person. When he finished, the room felt strangely light, as if everyone had been convinced that the hardest part was over. Judge Eleanor Whitcomb sat silently for several seconds. She flipped a page in the file, adjusted her glasses, looked up. Her eyes went to Arthur. "Counselor," she said, "before we go any further, I need to ask you something." Arthur straightened, confident. "Yes, Your Honor." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough to change the air in the room. "Do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" Arthur blinked. "I'm not sure I understand," he said carefully. Judge Whitcomb turned her gaze to me for half a second, long enough to register recognition, then back to him. "The woman your client is asking me to declare mentally incompetent," she continued. "Do you know anything about her professional background?" Arthur glanced down at his notes. "She's an accountant," he said. "She works locally." The judge didn't respond right away. That silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Enough time for discomfort to creep in. She turned to Helen. "Ms. Ward," she said, "would you like to clarify?" Helen stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't dramatize. "Your Honor," she said, "my client is a senior forensic financial investigator. She specializes in elder financial exploitation. She has testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases, many of them in this courthouse." Arthur's head snapped up. Leonard's jaw tightened. My mother froze. Judge Whitcomb nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already knew. "Thank you," she said. "That aligns with my recollection." Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it. The judge turned back to him. "Counselor," she said, "given this information, I'm curious why none of it appears in your filings." Arthur swallowed. "It didn't seem relevant to the petition, Your Honor." "On the contrary," the judge replied, her voice still calm. "It seems extremely relevant." She gestured toward Helen. "Ms. Ward, you may proceed." Helen didn't rush. She walked to the evidence table and placed a single folder in front of the clerk. Copies were distributed to the judge, to Arthur, to my mother. Helen began with the bank records, dates, amounts, patterns. She walked the court through each withdrawal, 7 in total, each occurring within days of my mother's documented visits to Ruth Cross. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She let the numbers speak. Arthur's face shifted as he followed along. He leaned closer to the documents, flipped pages faster. Helen moved on to the power of attorney. She highlighted the notarization, the name, the date. Then she submitted proof of the notary's retirement. The room went still. Leonard stared straight ahead. My mother shook her head once, sharply, as if denial alone could undo ink and paper. Helen wasn't finished. She introduced the journal. Excerpts were read aloud, carefully, respectfully. My grandmother's words, preserved exactly as she'd written them. Confusion, shame, fear, documentation. I watched my mother's face change, not with guilt, but with outrage. Not at what she'd done, at being exposed. Helen concluded by outlining the pattern beyond this estate, the similarities, the unanswered questions, the referrals already in motion. She sat down. Judge Whitcomb removed her glasses and placed them on the bench. She looked at Arthur. "Do you have a response?" Arthur stood slowly. His voice was thinner now. "Your Honor," he said, "we would request a brief recess to confer with our client." The judge nodded once. "Granted." As Arthur leaned toward my mother and whispered urgently, she finally looked at me. Really looked at me, for the first time in 19 years. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I just waited, because the question had already been asked, and it had changed everything. The recess lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I counted every one of them. Arthur Nolan leaned close to my mother, whispering rapidly, his confidence gone, his voice sharp with urgency. Leonard said nothing. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes unfocused, like a man who had already calculated his losses and was deciding which ones he could survive. Phoebe sat at the far end of the bench, hands folded in her lap, unmoving. When court resumed, Arthur stood. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "after conferring with my client, we would like to withdraw the petition." A ripple moved through the room. Not surprise, relief. The kind that comes when people think an unpleasant thing has been neatly wrapped up. Judge Whitcomb did not share it. She looked at Arthur for a long moment, then shook her head once. "No," she said calmly, "that will not be happening." Arthur blinked. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented," the judge continued, "this court is not prepared to simply allow this matter to disappear. What began as a probate petition now raises serious concerns of financial exploitation and fraud." My mother opened her mouth. Judge Whitcomb raised a hand. "Ms. Hale, you've spoken enough today." Silence fell, thick, final. The judge began listing actions, her voice measured, precise. The petition was denied with prejudice. The evidence would be referred to the district attorney's office. Copies would be forwarded to federal authorities for further review. Each sentence landed like a door closing. Arthur said nothing. Leonard finally shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that looked almost like resignation. My mother sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes wide, not with fear, but with disbelief. She had come here expecting control. She was leaving with consequences. Judge Whitcomb finished, signed the order, and looked directly at me. "Miss Cross," she said, "you are free to go." That was it. No gavel slam, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just paper, ink, and finality. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, like pressure releasing after months of being held in. Daniel was waiting in the hallway. When he saw my face, he didn't ask what happened. He knew. Helen stepped aside to make a phone call. I caught only fragments of her words. Yes, already forwarded. Exactly what we discussed. Arthur walked past us without meeting my eyes. Leonard followed, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed straight ahead. My mother lagged behind them, disoriented, clutching her purse like it might anchor her to reality. Phoebe stopped. She looked at me once, just once. Then she nodded. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Miss Cross," the voice said, "this is Special Agent Laura Mendez." She didn't waste time. She told me they had reviewed the materials, that the patterns extended further back than I realized, that Leonard Hale's financial history raised significant concerns. "They move faster when the paperwork is clean," she said. "Yours is very clean." Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Within 2, accounts were frozen. Within 3, arrests were made. Federal charges, wire fraud, mail fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The indictment ran 18 pages. Leonard was taken into custody first. My mother followed hours later. Their house was searched, documents seized, hard drives collected. Phoebe cooperated fully. She testified. She turned over records. She answered questions she'd been holding inside for years. The trial took place months later. I didn't attend most of it. I didn't need to. I had already done my part. When the verdict came back, I was at my desk. Guilty. On every count. My mother received 5 years. Leonard received more. Restitution was ordered, assets seized, properties liquidated. Everything built on stolen money unraveled exactly the way it always does. Quietly, thoroughly, and without mercy. My grandmother's estate was finally settled that summer. I kept the house in Riversend. Some things aren't meant to be sold. On Sundays, Daniel and I sometimes sit on the porch with coffee. I bring my laptop. He brings a book. The world moves slowly there, the way my grandmother liked it. My firm reinstated me the week after the hearing. My first case back involved an elderly woman whose nephew had taken nearly $90,000 from her retirement account. We got it all back. People think justice is loud. They think it announces itself. It doesn't. Justice works the way my grandmother taught me to live. Carefully, patiently, one record at a time. The hardest part came after everything was over. Not the arrests, not the verdict, not even the sentencing. It was the quiet. When the noise stopped, when the story ended, when there was no longer anything left to prove, I was forced to sit with what remained. And what remained was a truth my mother had never understood. About me, about my grandmother, about silence itself. People assume silence means weakness. They think the loudest voice belongs to the strongest person in the room. My mother believed that. She believed that if she spoke first, spoke longest, spoke with enough certainty, the world would arrange itself around her version of events. She had always lived that way. When my father left, she filled the house with noise, arguments, accusations, declarations. When she remarried, she announced her new life as if volume alone could erase the old one. And when she came for the inheritance, she did the same thing. She filled court filings with words. She filled hearings with claims. She filled the air with certainty. What she never noticed was that my grandmother had taught me the opposite. Ruth Cross believed in restraint. She believed that truth didn't need to be loud if it was precise, that records mattered more than explanations, that patience outlasted force. She used to sit at the dining table every Sunday morning, coffee cooling beside her, methodically balancing her checkbook. She didn't rush. She didn't assume. She checked everything twice. When she realized her daughter had betrayed her, she didn't confront her. She didn't argue. She didn't even tell me. She documented. That choice saved me. After the trial, I visited the house in Riversend alone for the first time. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces: the worn arm of the sofa, the chipped corner of the kitchen counter, the bookshelf where she kept her old lesson plans. In the back bedroom, I opened the dresser drawer where she used to keep envelopes of receipts. They were still there, yellowed with age, carefully labeled in her neat handwriting. Electric, water, groceries. Decades of quiet order. My phone buzzed while I was standing there. A message from Helen letting me know the final paperwork had been filed. Everything was complete. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it. Not triumph, not relief, but something steadier. Balance. The world had tipped in the right direction again. A few weeks later, my firm held a small meeting. No speeches, no apologies that tried to explain away doubt. Just a reinstatement notice and a quiet acknowledgement that they'd been wrong to sideline me without evidence. My first case back reminded me why I did this work in the first place. An elderly woman, a trusted relative, missing money, familiar lies. We followed the same process. Records, timelines, proof. It worked. It always does. Daniel and I didn't talk much about my mother after that. There wasn't anything left to say. Some people don't need closure. They need distance. We found ours in routines: grocery shopping on Sundays, long walks after dinner, quiet evenings that felt earned. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the correctional facility where my mother was being held. I didn't open it. I handed it to Helen. She read it and summarized it in one sentence. "Excuses," she said, "and self-pity." That was enough. Some paper trails aren't worth following. I kept my grandmother's journal, but not as evidence anymore. I keep it because it's her voice, because it reminds me that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like waiting. My mother thought I was weak because I didn't fight her immediately. She thought I was broken because I didn't shout back. She thought I would collapse under pressure because that's what she would have done. What she never understood was that I wasn't raised by her. I was raised by a woman who knew the power of quiet certainty. A woman who believed that if you kept your records, checked your facts, and trusted time to do its work, the truth would surface on its own. And it did. Not with drama, not with vengeance, but with clarity. The last thing my grandmother left me wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the journal that had saved me. It was perspective. Months after the sentencing, life settled into something steady. Not perfect, not dramatic, just honest. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. One evening in early October, Daniel asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. Nothing special, he said. Just somewhere familiar. We ended up at a small chain restaurant just outside the city. The kind of place people underestimate. Cheap wine, endless breadsticks, soft lighting that hides flaws instead of highlighting them. It was where we'd had our first date years earlier. Halfway through the meal, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't make a speech. He didn't get down on one knee right away. He just looked at me and said, "I think we've already proven we can survive the worst parts. I'd like to do the rest with you." When he opened the box, I felt something warm settle in my chest. Not surprise. Recognition. My grandmother would have liked him. She always said I needed someone steady, someone who didn't mistake chaos for passion, someone who wouldn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. I said yes. We didn't post it online. We didn't announce it loudly. We told people slowly, one conversation at a time, the way good things deserve to be shared. A few weeks later, I spent another weekend in Riversend. I cleaned out the last of the boxes in the attic, old lesson plans, photographs, holiday decorations wrapped in newspaper from decades ago. At the bottom of one box, I found a small envelope. Inside was a single index card, my grandmother's handwriting. It read, "If you're reading this, it means you trusted yourself." I sat on the attic floor and laughed through tears, because she was right. Trusting myself had been the hardest part. Not the investigation, not the courtroom, not even standing silently while my own mother tried to erase me. It was trusting that I didn't need to rush, that I didn't need to explain everything to everyone, that truth didn't require performance. The house in Riversend is still mine. We go there some weekends when the world feels too loud. Daniel reads on the porch. I work at the dining table where my grandmother used to sit, coffee beside me, spreadsheets open, not because I have to, but because it feels like home. My work continues. There are always new cases, new families, new versions of the same old story. Someone vulnerable, someone trusted, someone who thinks no one is paying attention. They're wrong, every time. People ask me sometimes how I stayed calm through everything, how I didn't lose myself in anger, how I didn't crumble when the accusations came from my own mother. I tell them the truth. I didn't stay calm because I was strong. I stayed calm because I was prepared, because I was raised by a woman who believed in receipts, in timelines, in writing things down even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. My mother thought silence meant weakness. She thought patience meant surrender. She thought volume could replace truth. She was wrong. Silence can be strategy. Patience can be power. And truth, real truth, doesn't need defending. It just needs space to be seen. If you followed this story from the beginning, staying with the quiet moments instead of waiting only for the loud ones, then you already understand that. Some stories aren't meant to shock. They're meant to remind you that careful people still win. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can inherit isn't money at all. It's knowing exactly who you are, even when someone else tries to tell the world you're not. And if stories like this, stories about quiet strength, patience, and truth, are the ones you tend to stay with until the end, then you're probably exactly where you're meant to be.
To point join in the chat to raid the dungeon that's on your screen there. It's a fun little game if you don't know it. You then you pick up like swords and body armor and helmets and all sorts of stuff, and then you can equip them to your character by pressing the orange tangerine button just above the chat on your phone. I don't know where it is on PC. I reckon that trailer's rear wheels lifted off the ground just then. I don't know how these guys have got their truck set up as well, but basically I've got it so that it's got a bit of movement. Like the steering wheel does exactly what the steering wheel in the game does. I can't remember the percentages, but I've got, I don't have the truck on 100% stable. I've made it so it feels realistic. I might actually have to turn that up, down a little bit, because I adjusted it only by 5% or whatever when I had a 2-axle prime mover, because it was terribly unstable. But I have a 3-axle one now in the game, and it's much more comfortable to drive. But yeah, basically I have I've got all of my settings are to try to make it realistic as far as the way the truck feels. So I don't know what these guys have got set up, but I have to, be careful. If anything, my brakes are a little bit better than what a truck in real life would be, but it doesn't matter. If I'm doing 100 kilometers an hour and I need to stop it in a hurry, it's not going to stop in a hurry. It doesn't matter. Even if you have it on 100% brake, whatever, I forgot they call it in the game, it's not stopping, especially when it's raining. This is pretty cool, actually. It's night time. Whoa, see that? that track with the helicopter on it just then, jumping. So we're gonna probably have a little bit of damage. Ooh. We have to turn off the cruise control and we gotta slow down a little bit.